let's start post-processing our sunrise time lapse. So this is a little more complicated than the previous one because there is an exposure change happening, or we have shot this in aperture priority. That means when there is a change in exposure, the camera automatically changes the shutter speed to compensate that. So obviously in the case of a sunrise, there is a change in exposure, the light keep increasing when the sun rises and the shutter speed keep increasing to compensate that. So this time lapse, there is a good chance that these kind of time lapses will have flicker and drastic exposure changes. So we might have to work a little more harder in post processing to get things right. So this particular case, this is very simple and straightforward. So let me open the sequence in LR time lapse. So this is my LR time lapse interface, and what I have to do is I have to get to the time lapse. So this panel will help me to get to the time lapse. So this is my time lapse. I have organized all the time lapse that we have shot. So this is the time lapse. So now LR time lapse is analyzing the particular time lapse. So it's loading all metadata into the software, so it can understand the exposure change, interval, and so on. So now you could see that here my aperture is a constant number, but my shutter speed keep increasing. So from the first, that is 1/160th was my shutter speed, and by the end of the time lapse it's 1/400. So it's keep increasing throughout the time lapse. So this is where we would need something like this, where there is an exposure change. It's not a constant exposure, and there can be back and forth that can create flicker. What is back and forth is sometimes it might come to 1/400 and go back to 1/200. So there might be a flicker just because the exposure is changing randomly. So in the sequence, one image will have 1/200 and the next image will have 1/400. So there is a chance of a flicker because the light immediately went down, or there is an exposure change. It all depends on how good your camera's meter is. So this camera, both Sony and Panasonic, does a very good job in this case, but still there are good chances that we will have flicker. So I have the sequence, and this shows my exposure values or luminance changes that happens throughout the sequence. So now what I have to do is I have to set couple of keyframes based on how much of exposure change happening, where all I wanted to control or where all I want to intervene in terms of these raw files. I will set keyframes. So here there is an option to keyframe. So based on how many inputs that I want to give or how many raw images that I want to edit, so I can go to the keyframe wizard and say that I need 4 keyframes or 5 keyframes. As I already mentioned, this time lapse is very straightforward and you would need so many keyframes, and I can do mostly through visual deflicker and auto transition. So I'm right now keeping 4 keyframes and saving the metadata. What does it do is these keyframes are saved in metadata, so I can get them in Adobe Lightroom. Now there is an option to drag this to Lightroom. So I can switch on my Lightroom and I can drag this particular sequence to Lightroom. So it imports all the sequence. Make sure that you are in add mode or you are not converting them as a DNG file or copying somewhere. So I'm clicking on the add mode and importing the entire sequence. So it takes a little time to import all the images to Adobe Lightroom. So once these sequences are imported, I'll have a filter which is already done. There are 2 filters that is created by LR time-lapse. One is the full sequence and one is the keyframes. What I have to do is I have to select these keyframes and do the adjustment, do the necessary adjustments. So now we have to identify these keyframes by clicking here and going to, there are LR time-lapse full sequence and LR time-lapse keyframes. So I would go to the keyframes. So as made in the software, I'll have 4 or 5 keyframes. So I have only loaded half of it, so I can see only 2 keyframes here right now. So once it is loaded, I'll have all the 4 keyframes which I have created in the software. So then I'll adjust these keyframes, I'll develop these keyframes and apply to the nearing sequence, nearby images. Based on the kind of changes that I wanted to apply, I would apply. So now I have all my 4 keyframes present in my Adobe Lightroom. So let me start working on each keyframes and apply this effect to the neighboring frames. So this is my first keyframe, or it's the first image itself. So I'll go to the develop module, and what again I'm doing the same thing, I'm going to Adobe Landscape. So this gives me a little more punch in the image. Yeah, same here also you can check how is the camera landscape. If that feels better, you could actually use camera landscape. It looks more or less the same. This shot in Sony a6300 with its kit lens. So I can see the fringes here. So sorry, I can see the vignetting here. So I wanted to remove the vignetting first. So what I can do is I can go down in lens correction, and first of all I'll apply the profile, remove chromatic aberration, remove lens aberrations. So first I'm undistorting the image, so you could see the difference. So it automatically picked the camera, that is the lens is Sony 1650. So it undistorted the image. Next is it even removed the vignetting, so you could see I didn't have to manually remove it. When the lens correction, it removed the vignetting as well as it undistorted the image. So now let's go back, and color temperature, again if you wanted you could go to check it out, and if you wanted to change it slightly to improve the overall thing. So I'm as of now keeping in as I shot. I might later revisit them. So I'll just, in this case I'll have to bring down the whites and highlights, and obviously dehaze. So I have much more details in the scene now. I'll increase the saturation a little bit. I'm checking with the white balance. Is there something I can do? I think this looks a little more punchy, so I'm keeping somewhere in the middle. If you want to expose this part, if as before, you could build a new graduated filter here, and you could create it's still fetching the initial previews. It takes as is the laptop, it might take a little more time to fetch all the previews. So it's a little slow while it is fetching the previews. So I'm trying to get a little more detail here in the shadows. So first of all, before this, I'll see that I can improve this by pulling the shadows a little more. I'm just improving the blacks a little. It might introduce a lot of noise, so make sure that you're not overdoing it. You can lift a little more shadows, but unless if you don't see a lot of noise, it's fine. If you are pushing it so much, there can be a lot of noise in the sequence. So push a little bit, not so much. A little more contrast. Again, back to the graduating fill. Still my previews are fetching, so there is a little lag in my performance. So I'm just here also, I wanted to give a little more blue, a little more punch there. I'm just checking what works here, whether it's a brighter blue sky works. So I have a little color added to the sky. Now I have adjusted one of the keyframes. Now I have to copy this to the rest of the keyframes, the basic settings, and tune the other keyframes based on what is required. So I can select all of them and go to develop settings and say sync settings. So what does it do is it copies whatever settings that I have done for my first frame to all the keyframes. So now I'll tweak the keyframes, what I have to do further for that keyframes, whether I have to bring down the exposure a little or whatever I have to do to that keyframe, I'll adjust that. Once that is done, I'll go back to the full sequence and come to my library module and switch on the tiles. It takes a little time, as it is a laptop, it's a little slower. So I have my first keyframe and rest of the images until my next keyframe is not corrected. So what I have to do is I have to select all the images from the first keyframe to the second keyframe and apply the corrections that I have done. I have already corrected other keyframes and adjusted whatever is required. Now what I have to do is I have to spread across these corrections what I have done to the rest of the frames. So now I have my first keyframe. So I'll just select rest of the frames until the second keyframe and I'll sync these settings. I'll go to develop settings and I'll go to sync settings. So what happens is whatever corrections that I have applied on those keyframes are applied throughout the frames until the next keyframes. After that, I'll go to make sure that once again check your frames, is the settings are applied correctly. Sometimes see, in this case all the settings are not applied correctly, especially the lens correction is not copied. So by default in Lightroom, the camera corrections or lens corrections are not applied as default. So once again go back and go up to my next keyframe until this and select all the keyframes, right click, develop settings, sync settings, and make sure that all the corrections including lens correction. I don't have a crop here, I just need to make sure that the lens corrections are, if you have crop you can enable that also. If you have removed any spot like a sensor dust, you could spread that also across. So in this case I am doing the lens corrections and I am asking to sync. So now including lens corrections will be synced to all the keyframes. Now after this I'll go to my second keyframe and go until all the halfway and sync all the settings. So make sure that everything is synced. After that I'll go to the last keyframe and sync the rest of the frames which is not yet corrected. I'm randomly syncing up to this many keyframes. From the last keyframe, I'm syncing couple of frames which is just behind that keyframe. In this case, there are no major changes happening in terms of exposure, so I could pick a random frame and sync until that. So I have used the first keyframe and synced all the settings until the second keyframe and second until the middle, and then the last keyframes I've synced the settings, which is whatever keyframes comes, like say whatever 50 or 100 keyframes before that, 100 frames before that last frame, I have synced the same settings. So that it'll be at least constant throughout those frames. So I just have to interpolate a little, or I just have to apply little smoothing. So the idea is to have similar settings to at least the frames between these keyframes. So what we are trying to achieve through this keyframes is I have a setting that is applied specifically to that keyframe. I'm trying to spread across that settings to the frames until next keyframe. Now from the next keyframe towards the next keyframe, I'll sync the settings that I have applied to that frame, that particular keyframe. The keyframe has slight tweaks based on the exposure. So where the exposure change is happening, those are the set of frames that you need to apply similar settings that is applied to the keyframe. So consider from there is an exposure change suddenly happening in 100th frame, and that is there from 100 to 200. I will use the 100th frame as a keyframe and apply the same correction throughout 100 to 200. So all of them are in same exposure. So basically this is to smoothen the exposure curve or exposure variations. So in this case, there are not much exposure changes and it is a very smooth and gradual change. In this case, it does not matter so much which all frames I include with the keyframes, because the exposure change is gradual and not much flicker is there. Based on the flicker, you might have to have more keyframes and spread across that keyframe settings based on the exposure change. In this case, even if I choose my first keyframe and sync that setting throughout the entire time lapse, it's going to be fine, because the changes that are there in this sequence is like, even though exposure is increasing, it's very gradual and smooth, and there are no sudden jerks, there are only very minute flickers. So even if I apply the same settings, that is the first keyframe setting, throughout this, it is fine. But why I'm using LR time lapse is that whatever the flicker is there, minor flickers, that I could avoid. So now once all these settings are synced, all these developed settings are synced, what I have to do is I have to save it into a metadata. Once all the settings are corrected, I'll go to metadata and say save metadata to files. So right now I'm saving all the metadata that I have, and whatever settings I have changed, I'm saving it as a metadata so LR time lapse can read. So I click on continue. So I'm going to metadata and saying that save metadata. Make sure that you have selected all the frames. So you are saving the metadata for all the frames that LR time lapse reads. What LR time lapse does is it only works in a raw file and it works through metadata, and whatever metadata that I have created, means these changes, these exposure values, these contrast values, whatever I have changed will be saved as a sidecar file or as a metadata file. So now when I go to LR time lapse, I can ask reload. So it starts reading the metadata from the file that we have saved from LR time lapse. So now you could preview this, but it still shows me the previous one, like that is how it was initially there. Now what I have to do is I can obviously apply an auto transition, or I can, at this point I can ask for a visual preview. What auto transition does is it tries to create a smooth transition between the keyframes. Here it is not very important, still I'll go ahead and do an auto transition. It will try to smoothen the curve between these keyframes. So it is important because if there are value changes in the keyframe, sudden value changes in the keyframe, it will try to smoothen those value changes. So once that is done, I could request for a visual preview. It would take some time. It would use the Adobe DNG converter and creates a small size preview of the sequence what we have created here. So it helps me to identify is there still flicker. So now it's started reading the file from Lightroom. So you could see the corrections that you applied in Lightroom is visible in the screen. So it takes some time to create this preview. Once the preview is done, we'll apply a visual deflicker if necessary to avoid some additional small flickers that is there in the scene. As it is a sunrise scene, there are a lot of chances that there might be flicker. The whole point of using LR time lapse for this sequence is to avoid those minor flicker. As mentioned earlier, I could still use After Effects and Adobe Camera Raw for this time lapse, as the changes are very smooth and gradual, but there can be minor flickers. Using LR time lapse, I could avoid those minor flickers and I could get a very good quality time lapse, clean time lapse. So now I'm started creating visual preview. You could maybe just see a couple of frames up to 4% it is done. You could see how much percentage of footage is done. how much percentage of the preview is done. Once the visual deflicker is done, we'll go back to Lightroom and render our final images. Our visual previews are done. Let's have a look at the LR time-lapse visual preview. So for me, everything looks fine. There are not much flickers, and there are very minor flickers. If you wanted, you can do a visual deflicker. I think it's fine. It looks good. Let's go ahead. We can then take it back to Lightroom and export it as JPEG sequence and later convert it to a video time lapse. So let's go back to Lightroom. So in Lightroom, what we have to do is we have to do the exact same thing. We have now saved the metadata from LR time lapse. Now we have to read that metadata. So what we can do is read metadata from files. So this warning message comes about overwriting this, but it's fine. We wanted to have the new metadata which has been saved by LR time lapse. So LR time lapse smoothen the curve, and now we can read that metadata from from Lightroom and export it as a JPEG sequence. So I'm reading the metadata, reading the XMP metadata. It's fine. It takes some time. Now let's once it is done, let's export it as a JPEG sequence. So this is done. I have read all the files, all the XMP files that has been saved by LR time lapse. Now what we have to do is export this whole thing as a JPEG sequence. Later we can convert them as a video. So now what we have to do is go to File, Export. So we have different presets. So you could burn it full size JPEGs into your hard drive. You have some presets from LR time lapse which allows you to export 4K images, and like different presets are available. So what I'm using is I wanted a regular JPEG, so I would choose JPEG in full resolution, and I would opt where you wanted to save. You can specify a folder, you can put it into a subfolder, and you can export it. So I have already exported the entire file. So let me show you the files which has been exported. So I have exported the whole time lapse here. So I have a whole JPEG sequence here which has been color corrected and deflickered using LR time lapse, and everything looks fine. Now what I have to do is I have to make it as a video. So to do that, I can either use Premiere or After Effects. So whichever is accessible, you could use that. As we are using After Effects, let's use After Effects. So I'll click on After Effects, and let's import all these sequences to After Effects and export it as a video file. I have my After Effects open. I'll press Ctrl I to import the sequence. So this time it's a JPEG sequence. So once I have the sequence, I'll create a new composition. So same as before, I'm using a Ultra HD 4K sequence with 24 FPS, and click OK. And again, I have not set the duration of this time lapse. You could here check the duration of the time lapse. Right now in 30 FPS, you could change. Right now sequence settings is 30 FPS. You can go to interpret footage and go to main and set the duration for 24 FPS. So depends on what is the composition frame rate. You could change the frame rate of the sequence. So I'm changing the frame rate of the sequence to 24. So what you have to do is right click, interpret footage, main, and assume the frame rate. I'm choosing 24 frames. So it will play back, the sequence would play back in 24 FPS. So now I have created the composition also of 24 FPS, and the total duration of this is 21 seconds and 6 frames. So I could change the composition settings to the same thing. It's 21 seconds, 6 frames. I'll verify it again. 21 seconds, 6 frames, 21 seconds, 6 frames. So I'll drop the time lapse to my timeline. So here what we can see is the time lapse which A6300 produces, or the images which A6300 produces, is a 6K image. You can either downscale it, around 64% would do, and I'm shooting it in GH5. The time lapse was shot in 16:9 aspect ratio, but here it is 3:2 aspect ratio. So you will have to crop a little, or you will have to choose where you want it. I I wanted more of a sky in this picture, so I'm cropping some of the mountains in the image and using this as my frame. You could use the frame however you want it, or you could even do a small animation, like I'm just going back to 100, and maybe I could keep a keyframe and I can set it however I want it and set a keyframe, and when you go to the end of the timeline, maybe even the halfway, I could reduce it to 64. So what I can do is I can create a small animation where it just gradually zooms out, because I have a higher resolution image. I'm able to play with it. Before, the GH5s was exactly 4K and I couldn't do much, but here I have a 6K image, so I'll be able to zoom out a little and maybe have to make a motion sidewise, or however you wanted, you could create some motion. So I have the end result here, I'll show you. So I have one time lapse where it gradually zooms out, a little slow while playing. So I have one time lapse which gradually zooms out while playing and reveals the entire mountain. This is something you can do if you have a higher resolution time lapse, or you could scale it down and render it as a normal time lapse, which shows the entire frame rate. You get a very sharp time lapse. So this is the advantage if you have a high resolution camera and you are able to shoot a time lapse more than the resolution of your final delivery format. You will be able to either zoom in or zoom into that or pan into the time lapse. So you could maybe create motion using post production. This is always a good idea to have a higher resolution camera and do some kind of a digital motion to your time lapse, where creating a motion on location or on the camera is expensive, that you need electronic panning device like a Genie Mini, or you need a slider, but you might be able to achieve that using some post production.